Welcome to the Explainer. If you've ever tried to memorize chess checkmates, it can honestly feel like a completely chaotic list of random piece combinations. But when we look at this taxonomy, it actually distills over 30 deadly checkmates into a highly structured, incredibly memorable toolkit of geometric traps. So let's dive right into it.
We've chunked these traps into 5 thematic categories today: anatomy of a checkmate, betrayed by friendly fire, cornered and executed, the deadly piece duos, and finally, disrespect and humiliation.
Let's jump right into Section 1, Anatomy of a Checkmate, setting the stage.
Okay, to really get this, we need to look at the foundational mechanics of how pieces perfectly coordinate to completely erase a king's escape routes. This brilliantly illustrates our baseline, the corridor pattern. Basically, the files adjacent to the king are entirely covered by 2 heavy pieces. They act like literal impenetrable walls. And once those walls are up, you simply send in the executioner, your queen, chasing after the king right down the middle of that corridor. It's a fundamental architectural trap, and it is devastating.
Now we can actually take that basic corridor concept and start mapping out its variations. Notice how the famous back rank mate relies on the king's very own pawns, trapping him on the last rank? They basically act as the wall, which lets a single rook sweep the 8th rank. Meanwhile, the diagonal corridor shifts the geometry entirely. It blocks a rank and a file, allowing a bishop to sweep in and mate on the open diagonal. So it's all about identifying exactly which escape routes are naturally blocked.
Moving right along to Section 2, Betrayed by Friendly Fire, when your own army traps you.
What's really wild is when a king's absolute greatest weakness isn't the enemy's overwhelming force, but his very own pieces turning the board into a cage. Let's compare 2 devastating traps here, the smothered mate and the suffocation mate. In both of these, a single solitary knight delivers the fatal blow. Why? Because the king's own pieces are literally suffocating him. The smothered mate happens when the king is completely trapped on all sides by his own army. The suffocation mate is incredibly similar, but the king technically has 1 empty escape square. Except, unfortunately for him, that single square is already covered by one of your pieces.
But you might be wondering, how do you actually force the king into that miserable position? It doesn't just happen by accident. To pull off either of these mates, you generally have to force the issue with a brilliant multi-move tactical sequence. Step 1, you hit them with a double check, forcibly driving the king to the corner. Step 2 is the real magic. You intentionally sacrifice your most powerful piece, your queen, just to lure an enemy piece onto the king's last breathing square. And finally, Step 3, you smother him with the knight. Game over.
So, the absolutely crucial point here is that the king's defenders actually become his prison walls. We see this beautifully in the epaulette mate. Notice how the king is blocked directly on his left and right by his own pieces? It perfectly resembles those decorative epaulettes you'd see on the shoulders of elite military personnel. Because his sides are completely blocked by his own army, your queen can just step right up into his face and deliver a close-quarters checkmate.
Now, Bodin's mate has some very specific requirements. First off, you need 2 bishops arranged in a sort of crisscross applesauce manner, slicing right through the board. Second, the king must be blocked by his own pieces. But that third point is where the crazy tactics come in. You need open diagonals to activate those snipers. A lot of times, to pull off Bodin's mate, you might actually have to boldly sacrifice a knight right in front of the king's pawn shield, just to rip the board wide open and let those bishops do their absolute worst from afar.
All right, Section 3, Cornered and Executed. Nowhere to run. When we force the king out of the safety of the center and onto the absolute edges of the board, the rook and knight become a uniquely lethal combination. This contrasts 2 legendary corner traps. The Arabian mate involves a rook horizontally hugging the king in the corner, and it's fully supported by a knight that conveniently covers the only escape square. Anastazia's mate uses those exact same 2 pieces, but slightly differently. Here, the knight and the king's own pawn act as a wall to block the escape route, while the rook just slides right down an open file to deliver the execution.
And if we tweak the geometry of that Arabian mate just a tiny bit, we get the hook mate recipe. It's essentially a vertical variation. The rook still checkmates, but vertically this time. The king is blocked by his own pawn, and crucially, your checking knight actually requires the support of one of your own pawns. It's a very specific chain of command for sure, but when all those ingredients perfectly align, the king literally has nowhere to run.
But what if you have your heavy pieces lined up for a corner mate, something like the H-file mate?
And a single enemy pawn is just standing there, ruining your hopes and dreams. While the source material gives us this incredibly direct piece of advice. Just break that shit open. Seriously, it means you don't play passively. You aggressively sacrifice a piece, even your queen, just to capture that pawn, forcibly ripping the file wide open so your rook can slide on down and finish the job.
And speaking of rooks, that brings us to the blind swine mate. This perfectly demonstrates the absolute overwhelming power of getting a pair of rooks anchored onto your opponent's 7th rank. The 2 rooks corner and just completely overwhelm the king, who is tragically blocked by just one of his own pieces on the side where the rooks can't quite reach. It's just absolute brute force geometry.
Moving to Section 4, the deadly piece duos, tag team coordination.
So here, we're examining checkmates that rely on sublime, beautiful tag team coordination between 2 complementary pieces. First up is the rook and bishop duo. We're contrasting the world-famous opera mate with Mayet's mate. In Mayet's mate, a rook delivers a back-rank blow supported by a bishop, but it absolutely requires the enemy king to be hemmed in by his own pieces. But take a look at the opera mate. By placing the bishop on the correct supporting diagonal, you create a mate that doesn't even require the king to have a blocking pawn. The coordination itself essentially builds an invisible wall.
Next is the queen and rook duo, which is perfectly encapsulated by the killbox mate. I mean, the name really says it all, doesn't it? You're physically using the intersecting movement lines of your queen and rook to construct a literal 3x3 geometric box around the opponent's king, right on the edge of the board. Once he is boxed in, the rook steps up to deal the finishing blow while the queen watches its back.
Now, what's really fascinating is what happens when you chain these duos together. Look at this 3-step sequence. You start with a triangle mate, where the queen mate's supported by a rook. Then, you seamlessly transition right into the killbox mate we just discussed. By rapidly looping these 2 patterns, you create what's known as the railroad mate. It's a sequence so incredibly fluid and devastating that grandmasters like Hikaru Nakamura will literally pre-move the entire sequence during time trouble. You're basically just bulldozing the king straight down the board.
The final duo we need to highlight is the queen and bishop. This maps 2 extreme ends of this partnership. On one side, we have the scholar's mate, which, let's be real, is probably the very first trap you learned as a kid. You advance the e-pawn and use a crisscross attack to target the weak f7 square. But on the other extreme is the highly advanced balestra mate. It's a display of just sublime coordination, where the queen and bishop cover perfectly alternating squares, leaving the king absolutely paralyzed.
And finally, Section 5, Disrespect and Humiliation, the ultimate flex. Okay, so these aren't just tactical victories, these are checkmates designed to inflict absolute emotional damage. We gotta start with the fool's mate. To quote our source material directly, this only happens if your opponent is purposefully trying to lose rating or is acting like, quote, an absolute buffoon with room temperature IQ. I mean, it's the ultimate humiliation because it literally ends the game in just 2 moves. Your opponent essentially has to have a total lapse in judgment and actively open up a fatal checkmating avenue for you the second the clock starts.
Now, if you want a more earned flex, look no further than the David and Goliath mate. This is exactly what it sounds like. A measly 1-point pawn stepping forward to deliver the final, inescapable checkmate to the enemy king. It is widely considered one of the most gangster ways to end a chess game, hands down. And if you really want to rub salt in the wound, you can even construct a position where you deliver this crushing pawn blow using the un pensant rule.
And lastly, we have the swallow's tail mate, which is beautifully described as a huge, deadly hug. This happens when you just march your queen right up into the king's face, completely unabashed. The king can't capture the queen because she's supported, and he can't step backwards on the diagonals because his own 2 pawns are just sitting there blocking his only saving graces. It's this suffocating, inescapable embrace to end the game. So we've mapped out the corridors, weaponized friendly fire, executed kings in the corners, synchronized deadly duos, and explored the absolute ultimate tactical flexes. Seeing this taxonomy laid out like this really makes the chaos of the board look a whole lot more like a grid of opportunities, doesn't it? So, you've seen the 30 deadliest patterns. Which trap are you going to set in your next game? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I will catch you next time.